Your heart stops, not slows, not falters, stops. The muscle that has been contracting roughly once a second for your entire life simply ceases to contract. Blood stops moving, oxygen stops reaching every cell that depends on it. By any reasonable definition, you are no longer a functioning organism. And in the 4 to 6 minutes that follow, something happens that nobody fully expected and that medicine spent decades trying to explain. Your brain does not simply go dark, it does something else entirely. Let's start with what we assumed for most of the 20th century. The dominant model was straightforward. The brain is the most metabolically demanding organ in the body. It uses roughly 20% of the oxygen your body consumes, despite being only 2% of its weight. Cut off the oxygen supply, and it shuts down within seconds. Within 4 to 6 minutes, the damage becomes irreversible. This model was accurate as far as it went. What it did not account for was what the brain actually does in those final minutes. Not nothing. Something that, when researchers finally started measuring it, turned out to be one of the most striking findings in modern neuroscience. We know now that in the minutes after cardiac arrest, the brain does not simply power down like a computer losing electricity. It generates a surge of activity. In some documented cases, the activity in the dying brain is more intense than anything recorded in normal waking consciousness. The neurons are not going quiet. They are firing in patterns that, in a living person, we would associate with heightened awareness and complex experience. And nobody, even now, fully understands why. The hard part is that we cannot ask easily. The obvious research challenge with studying the dying brain is that the subjects are dying. You cannot conduct a standard experiment. You cannot control variables. You cannot ask the subject what is happening inside them and compare it to what the equipment is reading. What you can do is watch, measure, record, and compare notes with the people who come back, because some of them do come back and some of them describe what happened while they were gone. Here is what the physiology shows. The brain runs on glucose and oxygen. When the heart stops, the delivery of both is interrupted. The neurons begin to exhaust their immediate reserves. You would expect them to simply fail. What some of them appear to do instead is something researchers call spreading depolarization. A wave of electrical activity moves through the cortex, firing as it goes, a last surge of signaling before the ionic gradients that power the system collapse entirely. In animal studies, this wave is measurable. In humans, the evidence comes partly from EEG recordings of patients in cardiac arrest and partly from the reports of those who survive resuscitation. The animal evidence came first. A study published in 2013 in the journal PNAS monitored the brains of rats in cardiac arrest and found that in the 30 seconds following the heart stopping, brain activity reached levels of coherence that exceeded anything recorded during normal waking states. The different regions of the brain were communicating with each other at higher rates and in more organized patterns than they had at any point while the animal was alive and healthy. Not slightly more organized, markedly more. The researchers measured cross-frequency coupling between brain regions, a signature of complex information processing, at levels that the animals had not produced during sleep, during alert wakefulness, or during any other measured state. The researchers were not expecting this. Like, the findings sat outside what the existing model would predict. The model said the brain should be going dark. The data said it was briefly doing the opposite. Something in the dying brain was generating more organized activity, not less, precisely when the system was losing the inputs it needs to function. This is where it gets genuinely difficult to discuss without either overstating or understating the case. The surge does not mean the brain is conscious during cardiac arrest. It does not prove that what people report experiencing after near-death events is a direct record of what happened physiologically. The relationship between brain activity and conscious experience is the hardest problem in science. We do not have an equation that converts one into the other. What we have is the observation that the expected silence doesn't happen. And we have the reports, thousands of people who have been resuscitated from cardiac arrest have described experiences during the period when their hearts were not beating. The consistency of those reports across cultures, across languages, across people with no prior knowledge of near-death literature is itself a finding that requires explanation. The common features are well documented: a sense of clarity, a feeling of observation from outside the physical body, encounters with light or with figures described as familiar, a life review, the rapid sequential recall of personal memories that is among the most frequently reported elements and among the hardest to dismiss as random neural noise. In a 2023 study led by Sam Parnia at NYU Langone, researchers monitoring cardiac arrest patients found that 1 in 5 survivors reported some form of lucid experience during the period when they had no measurable cardiac output. 1 in 5 in a population of people who, by standard medical definition, were clinically dead. The life review is worth examining carefully. The rapid, vivid, sequential recall of personal memories during a near-death event is not easily explained as a hallucination produced by a failing brain. Hallucinations generated by damaged or depleted neural systems tend to be fragmented, disorganized, poorly connected to autobiographical reality. They do not typically respect chronology. They do not typically cohere around a recognizable self moving through specific remembered time. What people describe in life reviews is the opposite of that: highly organized, chronologically structured, rich in specific personal detail that the person can recall and recount after resuscitation with the same coherence they would apply to any other memory, emotionally coherent in a way that random neural firing would not predictably produce. Researchers studying this have proposed several mechanisms. One is that the surge of activity in the dying brain activates the memory consolidation pathways, particularly in the hippocampus, in a way that produces something like accelerated memory retrieval. Another is that the same spreading depolarization that produces the final EEG surge triggers a cascade of activity in the temporal lobe, which is the region most associated with autobiographical memory and with a sense of self across time. Neither explanation is established. Both are consistent with what the imaging and recording data shows. There is also the harder question of timing. Many people who report near-death experiences describe events they could not have perceived during the period when they were conscious and had functioning senses. The classic case is the patient who reports seeing the resuscitation from above, describing the positions of the medical team, the equipment used, the sequence of events. Details they could not have seen from where they were lying, and during a period when their eyes were closed and their brain was supposedly inactive. These accounts appear across different hospitals, different countries, and different cultural contexts in ways that suggest they are not being generated by prior knowledge of what cardiac resuscitation looks like. Some of these accounts have been investigated. Some have been corroborated by independent witnesses. The methodology is genuinely difficult, and the corroborated cases are far fewer than the reported ones, but they exist, and they remain unexplained. The question of what the brain is doing after the heart stops is not the same question as whether there is experience during that period. The first is a physiological question. The second is the hard problem of consciousness applied to an extreme case. What we can say with confidence is that the brain is not doing nothing. The neurons are not simply losing power and falling silent in an orderly shutdown. Some process is happening that we do not yet have the tools to fully characterize. Whether that process involves experience in the way we mean when we use that word, whether there is something it is like to be a brain in those final minutes, is a question that the physiology alone cannot answer. The physiology can only tell us that something is happening. It cannot tell us whether anyone is home to experience it. What we don't know is whether the silence that follows, the flatline that follows the surge, represents the end of whatever that process was, or simply the end of our ability to measure it. The instruments we have were designed to measure the living brain. They were not designed for this, which means the question is not only what the brain is doing after the heart stops, it is also whether we have the right tools to find out. whether there is something it is like to be in that final surge of activity before the wave passes and the signal goes quiet. The honest answer is that we don't know. And the honest answer to whether we are close to knowing is also, for now, that we are not sure. What we know is that it is not nothing. And not nothing in this particular context is more complicated than it sounds.